welcome to Power Play on this Tuesday. I'm Vashi Capellos in Ottawa. Tonight, talk of making Canada the 51st state returns.
He believes that Canadians would benefit greatly from becoming the 51st state.
We're going to have the latest reaction to those comments as Donald Trump's trade war continues to threaten the Canadian auto industry in moments. Plus, gearing up for this week's leaders' debates in Montreal. Could the debates turn the tides of the campaign and sway voters before advance polls open on Friday? We're going to dig into the numbers with pollster Nick Danos, plus some breaking news on the timing of the French debate tomorrow in moments. Then a major shakeup. Longtime Conservative MP Ed Fast endorses independent candidate Mike de Jong in BC. We're going to talk about that with our front bench, and Ed Fast will join me live in moments. That's coming up. First, though,
I would reject the president's position on Canada has shifted. Perhaps he just hasn't been asked about Canada by questions from this group in the Oval Office when they see him almost every day, but the president still maintains his position on Canada. The United States has been subsidizing Canada's national defense, and he believes that Canadians would benefit greatly from becoming the 51st state of the United States of America.
The U.S. is once again ramping up its rhetoric against Canada. As you heard there, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt echoing what the president has said in the past about Canada becoming the 51st state, rather. It's the first time there's been talk, though, of annexing Canada since Mark Carney's phone call with President Trump a few weeks ago. And this all comes as Trump's trade war continues to send shockwaves through the Canadian economy. According to a Japanese newspaper report this morning, Honda is considering moving production out of Canada and into the U.S. in response to those tariffs. Now, Honda is denying the report. So is the federal government. Is it a harbinger of things to come? I'm with CTV National News correspondent Colton Prale, who has the latest on these developments, kind of like an evolving story throughout the day, Colton. We hear in the morning that Honda could be one of the first companies now responding to these tariffs, moving their manufacturing out of Canada. Then they deny it. The federal government denies it. What's going on here?
Yeah, we saw Doug Ford come out even before that saying that he'd had conversations with Honda Canada. I mean, there's obviously two bodies here as well. There's Honda and there's Honda Canada, and there could be some wires crossed in the early stages of that. But we've also seen this pattern play out already. We're seeing plant shutdowns, temporary or not. It's happening. People are losing their jobs. They're being laid off. And this was the express intent of these U.S. tariffs. This is exactly why Donald Trump did this. And so this assertion from the federal government and from Honda Canada that this isn't something that they're considering, I think there is a healthy degree of skepticism to take with that, knowing what else is happening in the auto industry. You combine that with how the federal government is responding, directly inputting options in order to convince businesses to stay in Canada, to not offshore their manufacturing, and you're left in a situation where even if it's not something they're considering right now, it is something to be prepared for and plan solutions around.
Yeah, I thought that the statement from Honda, it will operate at full capacity, this plant in particular, for the foreseeable future, and no changes are being considered at this time. Industry Minister Anita Anand said she spoke with the CEO at length and is reassured. But as you point out, they've built this structure now around counter tariffs and saying they won't necessarily apply to your company as long as you keep production here, and they will apply if that production goes elsewhere. So even that is kind of a tacit acknowledgement that that threat exists, is it not?
Absolutely. You don't build out backup plans unless you need them or you think you might need them. And that ultimately is the situation we find ourselves in. No matter what happens with these tariffs, with future tariffs from Donald Trump, this is a very explicit plan to bring manufacturing back into the United States, and other countries will need to defend those jobs in order to stop it from doing so.
And just before I let you go, we've got some breaking news on the French debate taking place tomorrow night. Change in time because of what else in this country but hockey? Yeah.
That's just it. Yeah, Montreal Canadiens didn't get the job done last night, which means tomorrow night is the night for them. They need the win to clinch their playoff spot. Obviously, that's going to be a big deal in Quebec. It's taking place at the same time as the French debates. Now, it was going to be the game at 7 and the debates starting at 8. We've got the debates starting at 6 now. That doesn't clear up the schedule conflict, but it does at least give you an hour of airtime that doesn't have that conflict. The Bloc, the NDP, both of them pushed for the debate to be moved. And obviously, if you're a third party in this race, you'd really like all the eyeballs on you that you can get.
That's the way to put it. They sure would. Colton, thank you so much. That's our Colton Prale reporting. Here's how the political party leaders are responding to that initial report that Honda could move production into the U.S., despite the company denying it.
President Trump deserves nothing but condemnation for the unfair targeting of Canada. While he's lifting tariffs and backing down on tariffs all around the world. He continues to tariff our auto sector.
This is potentially going to impact thousands of jobs in Canada and have a devastating impact on the automobile sector for the long term. And so it really highlights how we need to really fight back and get these tariffs removed.
Let's get some more perspective on all of this from Brian Kingston. He's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Brian, thanks for making the time. I appreciate it. I know Honda is providing assurances today that this won't be the case. How concerned are you about it potentially being beyond the foreseeable future, maybe a few weeks later than that?
Well, look, as every day passes and these tariffs remain in place, the risk to the industry becomes higher and higher. Just last week, a report came out from the Center for Automotive Research that found that the costs incurred by manufacturers in the U.S. of these tariffs is going to exceed $108 billion impacting almost 18 million vehicles. That's not just on the Canadian side, that's across North America. So every day these tariffs are in place, costs are incurred, damage is done to the industry, and ultimately we're weakening the North American auto sector.
So what are your primary questions, I guess, for the federal government as far as their counter-tariff and other kind of tariff-associated policy is concerned at this point?
Well, look, the announcement today with respect to the emissions framework is the best policy in a series of very bad choices. We're in a very difficult position because of U.S. trade policy. What the federal government has put forward is meant to give manufacturers that have a footprint here the ability to continue to import cars so they can remain profitable, but while also securing the footprint by threatening to remove that ability should production slow down. At the end of the day, the objective needs to be getting to the negotiating table as quickly as possible with the Americans once our election is over and finding a permanent solution here. This is not good economic policy what the Americans are pursuing. The costs are just simply too high for this industry. So we've got to get back to a North American market where we have integrated supply chains. That has to be number one objective. And frankly, if that doesn't work out, then we consider other options, but I don't want to go there at this point.
Do you, and I understand why you wouldn't, but are you worried about the proposition that you just put forward not essentially lining up with the world that Donald Trump has dreamt up for himself or the type of economy that he's dreamt up for himself?
Always a risk. But look, I just come back to the numbers, and what the U.S. is doing right now is potentially going to drive their own economy into a recession. And when you think about the automotive supply chain, it's not just about North America. There are components and parts that are coming in from around the world that are now being tariffed. Think about the tariff on China, which controls 80% of the global EV battery supply chain. 145% tariff on those inputs. This is going to make the industry deeply uncompetitive, while other manufacturers around the world are not exposed to these costs. So I just come back to the fact that this is bad for America, and therefore it can't be pursued to the fullest extent. That's why I do think we're going to get to the table and we'll find an off-ramp. And, we did just negotiate a deal with the Americans, and it was lauded as the best agreement ever negotiated. So I think we've got a good place to start from.
What are your conversations like with, the manufacturers, for example, that everyone is so worried about leaving? Like I interviewed the industry minister a number of weeks ago, and she said she had conversations where she got assurances, but there is a tacit acknowledgement in the counter-tariff structure they announced today that the possibility exists. Like, are you getting any assurances?
I think the biggest problem out there right now is just uncertainty around how all of this works. It's very difficult to plan. I mean, this is a sector that has very long lead times. When you think about the time it takes to design a new vehicle, set up your manufacturing facility for it, bring it to market, long lead times and capital intensive. Right now, we can't even get clear answers from the Americans on really basic questions about how these tariffs are being implemented. The tariff on Canada is supposed to be 25%, but you back out your U.S. content in the vehicle. It's not clear how you actually do that because the implementing direction from the U.S. hasn't specified a timeline for how that process would take place. So deep uncertainty in an industry that needs long time horizons and makes major capital investments. So what happens in these situations, and we saw this during the last negotiation of the USMCA is that companies just hold off making decisions because you can't make decisions in this environment, and that's bad for the economy.
And is that what you're seeing? Like, is there an inertia around investment decisions?
Now is not the environment to be making major automotive decisions. That's absolutely certain, because U.S. trade policy is changing by the minute. If the Americans were committed to creating a U.S.-only supply chain, you would need to see signals that this was meant to be a long-term policy that they were going to pursue to the fullest extent. Instead, what we see is tariffs go in force, pressure is put on the administration, either through markets or through other forces, and the whole plan changes overnight. So in that type of environment, where there is absolutely no clarity, it's very difficult to make long-term investment decisions. So I think that's what we're going to see for the next few weeks, if not months. You'll have to delay all of this until we have clarity around what the trade relationship is going to look like and what the Americans are ultimately trying to achieve here.
Okay, Brian, I'll leave it on that note. Thanks for making the time for the conversation tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's Brian Kingston. I want to turn to some news developing over the afternoon. A press release landed in our inbox from former Conservative MP, or outgoing, I should say, Conservative MP and longtime member of Parliament, very familiar to people who watch this program, Ed Fast, who announced that he was endorsing not the Conservative candidate in his riding to replace him, but an individual running, a very well-known individual in British Columbia, Mike de Jong, as an independent. And Mr. Fast is with us live right now to talk about that decision. Hi, Mr. Fast. It's good to see you. Thank you for making some time for this.
Good to see you too, Vashi.
It's been a while. I wanted to ask you about this decision. Obviously, there were a couple of options available to you: support the Conservative candidate, not support anyone. You decided to come out in detail, or sort of state in quite lengthy detail why you wanted to support Mr. de Jong instead. What can you tell Canadians watching tonight about that decision?
Well, I can tell you, first of all, Vashi, that I still support the election of a strong Conservative government under Pierre Poilievre, but this is not the way to do it. What happened in Abbotsford effectively was that the nomination process was hijacked by party officials, in which they disqualified by far the most qualified candidate, which is Mike de Jong, and qualified what is arguably the most unqualified and inexperienced candidate. And I still am having trouble getting my brain around how they came to the decision to have a 25-year-old student lead our community at a time when we've got Donald Trump's tariffs threatening, especially my community of Abbotsford and Langley. We're expected to really take the brunt of tariff imposition. The farming sector, the trucking sector, the manufacturing sector, all are implicated here in Abbotsford. To have an inexperienced novice representing us in Ottawa is just unfathomable. And of course, Mike de Jong clearly has got the resume, he's got the experience, 30 years, senior levels of government in the province of British Columbia. We now have two Conservative choices in Abbotsford. I think you know who I'm supporting, and I fully suspect that the voters of Abbotsford and Langley are going to choose Mike de Jong as well.
You wrote the process, basically, that unfolded was far from open and fair. It now appears the party insiders, conspired to manipulate the process to ensure that their chosen 25-year-old candidate, until very recently a Liberal supporter, as you write, was quote-unquote elected. When you talk about party insiders, when you characterize it as conspiring to manipulate the process, do you have any evidence of that? Do you know that to be true?
Yes, I do. And I've spoken to party officials who I will not name, who have admitted that what they did, or what the party tried to do, was appoint a candidate in my riding. And this is happening in other ridings across the country as well. And because there was such pushback about this being a staunchly Conservative riding with a long-standing member of Parliament, the party backed off from appointing. They went through a sham process of allowing 6 candidates to campaign for a full year, signing up thousands of members, when in fact, now it turns out it was pretty clear that their intention was to have their anointed candidate, a 25-year-old student, effectively, step into that role when nobody knew the guy, in the preceding years. He's never been involved in conservative politics, whereas all the other candidates they've earned their right to actually represent our community. So I felt in this circumstance that Mike de Jong was by far the most qualified candidate to represent our community, and I've chosen to publicly endorse him to be the next member of parliament for our area.
So for people who are watching outside of BC, Mike de Jong is a well-known political entity in British Columbia and has been for years. He was probably, at the outset of the campaign, one of the bigger surprises, the fact that his candidacy didn't go forward, just to the more general population, the more general electorate. I remember asking a number of questions of people who might know, well, what happened? And I'm going to tell you straight out what they told me, and I wonder if you were told the same thing, that basically he supported a different candidate in the leadership race, and that the people who ran the federal campaign, felt that was a deciding factor for them. Do you think it's as simple as that, or is there more to it? And ultimately, do they not have the right to make that call?
I don't know the truth of that assertion, and I'm not going to speculate as to what were the motives behind effectively appointing a candidate in our riding. I do know this. The party has the right to appoint if they wish. In fact, all the parties across Canada appoint from time to time. My beef is they weren't transparent with what they intended to do. They told me all along it was going to be a fair and open process. They told Mr. de Jong it was going to be a fair and open process. In fact, I understand party officials sat down with Mr. de Jong and encouraged him to actually run. At the end of the day, we find out that, in fact, they had a candidate in the wings that they wanted to appoint because they feared pushback from our community. They effectively manipulated the nomination process to ensure that their preferred candidate would win. And this candidate is so woefully inexperienced. And by the way, that's no comment on his character or anything like that. But I think everyone acknowledges this is not a highly experienced individual who can immediately step in and make a difference for Abbotsford and Langley in Ottawa, and in pushing back on some of the challenges we're facing from around the world, including from President Trump.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. Mr. Fast, I appreciate you making the time. I know you have to board a plane, so safe travels. Thanks for the conversation.
You're very welcome.
This longtime outgoing Conservative MP, Ed Fast. Our front bench will be with me in a few moments to talk about that. We've got Brian Gallant, James Moore, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie on tap. Just before we go, though, I do want to tell you what the Conservatives said in response to Ed Fast's original statement. In this election, they wrote us, Canadians will have a choice between giving the Liberals a fourth term after the lost Liberal decade of blocking our resources, taxing our workers, and driving billions of our dollars into the hands of the Americans, or electing a new Conservative government that will put Canada first by unlocking our resources, cutting our taxes, building our homes, and strengthening our country so that we can face the Americans from a position of strength. The statement goes on to say from the campaign, we are proud of our slate of Canada First Conservatives who are ready to bring home Canada's promise. We will not comment on reasons certain individuals did not become Conservative candidates. We'll take a quick break, more Power Play right after that break.
I look forward to the debate. I work on my French every day. I improve, but I think I improve. These debates are important, but they're part of a bigger communication with Canadians in this crucial election.
I'm going to take on Mark Carney for the fact that he is proposing massive cuts to the services that people need. I'm going to take on Pierre Poilievre, who wants Canada to be the United States in all but name.
So the election is really about change. Do you want a fourth Liberal term of skyrocketing costs and crime? Or do you think it's time for a new Conservative government? that will change things so you can afford food and homes and be safe on your street.
As party leaders get set for this week's debates in Montreal, which could prove very significant given how close a race this is, we wanted to get a lay of the land and state of that race from our pollster of record here at CTV News. Nick Nanis is the chief data scientist at Nanos Research, and he joins me now in studio. The debate time, big breaking news.
Oh, yeah.
Nick, yeah, Montreal Canadiens will get their glory tomorrow night, and more people will be able to watch because the debate has now been moved from 8 o'clock to a 6 o'clock start. But before we get into the possibility or the potential of these debates to kind of impact voters and their decisions, tell us where things stand right now. I thought the headline out of your numbers this morning was fascinating, that the Conservatives are riding a high they haven't seen in so long, and yet, it probably will not, at least according to these numbers, be enough.
It's just not enough. You know, the thing is when we look at the CTV News Globe and Mail tracking, it's 44-39 for the Liberals. And you know what? Look at that 39 number, Vashi. Stephen Harper, 2011 majority government, that's what he had when he formed. So, you know, for all those Conservatives that go out to the rallies and think and say, hey, this feels like we're winning, these polls can't be wrong. Well, you know what? They're correct. The polls are right, but they're correct also because, you know, we haven't seen support within an election for the Conservatives at this level for such a long time. But what those folks at those Conservative rallies don't see is the collapse of the NDP, the drop of the Bloc, and how that's benefited the Liberals. And we're in this bizarro world where 39% for any party is not enough to win an election and the greatest number of seats in the House of Commons.
We'll talk about the seats for a moment, because how does the efficiency of that popular vote translate for both of them?
Yeah, the thing is that, you know, for the Conservatives, because they're like 30 points ahead in the prairies, it's just inefficient. All that extra support that they have that bumps up their national numbers is not good at converting into seats compared to the Liberals when we look at the different regions where they're like 5 and 10 percentage points ahead of the Conservatives. So, you know, the thing is for the Tories, they not only have to tie the Liberals, they actually need to be ahead of the Liberals in order to garner a greater number of seats.
The other thing that sticks out to me when I see how high the level of popular support for those two parties is, like, how many undecided people are left at this point?
Not a lot. Actually, it's much lower, Vashi, than we've seen in previous elections. It's in the single digits. Usually at this point in the election, I've been doing nightly tracking since 2004, about 12 to 16% of Canadians are undecided. When we look at the undecided now, you can see only about 1 in 20 are undecided. However, those are the people that say that they are absolute decided. They're not even leaning towards any political parties. But in other research that we did with CTV News and the Globe and Mail suggested that 1 out of every 5 or 20% could change their mind going into the end of the campaign. And this is where the debate becomes critical.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the debate and in what way. I mean, I know that there's sort of like a conventional way of looking at it, like who lands a knockout blow, who gets all the social media attraction. But ultimately, are the stakes for, in particular, Carney and Poilievre dependent on, different expectations? Are they dependent on maybe just escaping that knockout blow? Like, what is your view on that?
I think the expectations are different for Carney and for Poilievre. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Liberal fortunes are directly tied to the personality and the performance of Mark Carney, right? It's not because people like the Liberals. It's not because they're happy with what they've seen over the last 10 years. It's because Mark Carney has been grafted. I don't know if there's a graphic, but he's been grafted on top of the Liberal Party. So his performance will be critical. He doesn't necessarily need to win, but he can't lose. For Pierre Poilievre, the reality is he is leading a movement of change for people that want the Liberals out. So, for Pierre Poilievre, he is a vehicle. He is an instrument to punish the Liberals and to get the Liberals out of power. So I think there's probably less stress for Pierre Poilievre than Mark Carney. And I think the language dynamic is another kind of wild card in this, in that what Mark Carney has to make sure is he doesn't have some sort of blooper that ends up being an attack ad in Quebec that could be used probably by the Bloc, because in the province of Quebec, the relationship primarily is between the Liberals and the Bloc. The Liberals go down and the Bloc are more likely to go up than the Conservatives.
Can I conclude on a question about that in the parties that are all the rest, essentially, at this point? The Bloc, the Greens, the NDP, and in particular maybe the NDP, because their fortunes have fallen faster than almost any other party. How can this debate change anything for them in a tangible way?
I don't think so. I think it could change it for the front runners, because the question is for Blanchette, for Jagmeet Singh, for those leaders, especially those two leaders, they could do damage to either one of the frontrunners. And I think that's going to be the one thing to watch. Whether they can turn around their political fortunes, it's really hard to tell right now.
Okay, I'll leave it on that. Nick, thanks so much. I appreciate it. The chief data scientist and founder of Nanos Research, Nick Nanos. We'll take a quick break. On the other end of that break, we'll talk about the state of the race and look ahead to those debates with our front bench. Brian Gallant, James Moore, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie will join me. There they are in just 2 minutes. Stay right there.
Our approach to fiscal discipline will mean that the federal government will spend less so that Canadians can invest more. We will catalyze an era of investment and growth in Canada that we have never seen before.
We need is change. This is a change election. Change so that you can afford food and a home. Change so that your paycheck grows faster than your cost of living. Change so that you're safe in your neighborhood.
New Democrats are committed to fighting for you and your family, are committed to a tax system that is more fair, to investing in you, investing in the services that you need, not giving tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires, but investing in everyday people.
Welcome back to Power Play ahead of this week's debates. And just before the break, we were learning from Nick Nanos that it is as incredibly tight a race as it gets between the Conservatives and the Liberals. You heard him talk about how the Conservatives are polling at a 14-year high at around 39% in his overnight tracking, but that's still likely in this scenario will not be enough to clinch government. With me now to unpack the state of the race at this juncture is our front bench. Former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant is here. He's now the CEO of Space Canada. Former Conservative Industry Minister James Moore is here. He's now a senior advisor with Edelman. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us, as is the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Rob Benzie. Hi, everybody. Very nice to see you. Tom, I'll start with you. Happy Tuesday, everyone. I thought Nick's comments were very interesting because frequently on this panel, we have talked about this sort of like, how do you reconcile the enthusiasm of the support for the Conservatives with these top-line numbers in the aggregate and polling? And his point was very much that you can, because this is record-breaking support for the Conservatives. It's just this so unique situation where the Bloc and the NDP's support has eviscerated to the advantage of the Liberals.
And I would even add the Greens. I mean, when you're at 1.3%, you're within the margin of error of zero. So it's no fun. And what we've talked about for a while is the fact that this is boiled down to a two-horse race. It's the Liberals, 5-6 points ahead, depending on the day in the polling. And the Conservatives with a number that in any other election is much higher than anything Andrew Scheer or Aaron O'Toole got, but it's not going to be enough. And not only is the Raw sticking with the same image horse race number, not in favor of the Conservatives. The Liberals have that 5-point lead. But beyond that, it's the question you asked, Nanos, at the end, Vashi, about the efficiency of the Liberal vote, because their vote is better spread out. That's the simplest way of saying it. They'll win pretty well all the seats in the GTA by 1 or 2 or 3,000 votes. Yes, the Conservatives will win tons of seats in Alberta and Saskatchewan by 10, 15, 20,000 votes. But it's, a seat's a seat. And this system is based on seats. And that's why the Conservatives got more votes than the Libs in both 2019 and 21 with Scheer and O'Toole, respectively. But the Liberals formed a minority government. That and the fact that the potential voting pool, those people who would be willing to vote Liberal if their candidate has no chance, is much larger, because I don't know too many Greens who would be thinking of voting for Mr. Poilievre, and very few NDPers. There might be some, in the labor movement who would go that way, but overall, any of those changes would be more likely to go to the Liberals. So it's that larger pool, it's that universe of potential voters, I think, that tips the whole thing in favor of a Liberal government. And again, we're a couple of weeks out. I like reminding people that the Orange Wave that Jack and I rode to 59 seats in Quebec really only formed in the last couple of weeks of that election back in 2011. So there's still lots of politics left between now and the final vote count. I think one of the striking things, as Tom mentions, James, is the level of, or lack thereof, of support for example, the NDP in particular, but even the Bloc to a certain degree, and definitely the Greens. What do you think it is about this election that has
cause at this moment in the election, I should say, so many Canadians turn away from those parties as options, as viable options?
Well, I think Canadians are smart and they know what's in front of them. And they know that, look, through the sweep of Canadian history, about 1 in 3 elections yields a minority parliament. We've now had 2 in a row. And I think people recognize that among the reasons why Donald Trump is able to yield the belligerent power that he's yielding, not only against Canada, but against the world, is because he has the Congress, he has the Senate, he has the White House, he won the Electoral College, he won the plurality of the popular vote, he's stacked the courts, and he has all this momentum behind him. Well, I think that requires Canada to have a government that is a majority government that has a firm mandate of clarity and purpose around a prime minister who can push back and do so firmly. And so right out of the gate, I think Canadians know that that's the formula. Maybe they don't articulate it how I just did, but I think Canadians have an instinct that there are moments where you need a majority government to have that firmness of a mandate, to make quick decisions, to protect industries that are in trouble, to help Canadians who might be suffering, or frankly, to reach an arrangement with the Americans in the USMCA environment that could be accretive to the Canadian economy. But the ability to move quickly and responsibly in defense of Canada. So then the question comes down very quickly is, who do you want to be your prime minister, Pierre Poilievre or Mark Carney? And that's what we're going to see showcased in the 2 leaders' debates of which of these 2 people do you want to look at on your phone or on your television every day for the next 4 years in the back and forth with the president of the United States. And I think Pierre Poilievre has a strong, the message, the clip that you showed there, right, which is, 10 lost years. We really want to do that. And I think that pivoting out of the debates, the hope is that over the 4-day weekend from Good Friday through to Easter, is that a lot of couples will look at each other and they say, it's been 10 years, it's kind of been lost. I think Poilievre's a good guy. I think he's ready. I think he's a good guy, and I think he's ready. Basically the same math that Canadians offered to Justin Trudeau in 2015 of, I think he's ready, I think he's up for the job. And I think Pierre Poilievre will try to close that case in the debates, and I think he's got a strong case to make.
Do you think, Brian, that ultimately that is the way that Canadians are viewing it, very much focused on the 2 individuals and their, the possibility of what they will be like as prime minister up against Trump or up against any economic challenge we face?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors at play. James's point, I think, is a really interesting one to frame the psyche of Canadians, and frankly, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the idea that there's a crisis, there's a perception of crisis, whether it's about sovereignty or whether it's about our economic future and our most important and significant trading relationship. There's definitely, I think, a tendency when there is a crisis to rally behind your government. Now, this is an interesting time because it's been 10 years of a government that there's no question was sort of feeling like it was near the end. And then all of a sudden you have a new leader and new circumstances. And again, I think some rallied behind the government, but there's still a very passionate group that would want change. And I think that also goes to what Nick Nanos was explaining in terms of support. There are not only a lot of people still supporting the Conservatives more than usual, I think a lot of them are very passionate. And I think especially if you go out west, probably even more so. With that, I do think the other factor that's at play is the idea that the NDP has propped up the Liberal government. There's so much that has happened over the last sort of few months, but we kind of forgot that part. And history shows us when a third, so-called third party props up a government, usually they have a tough time in the next election. I mean, that's just, it's very rare that that's not the case, right? So history seems to be repeating itself in that way as well. It's not the only force at play here, but I certainly think that's one as well. And then the Bloc, I'm not going to profess to know the intimacies of Quebec politics. We all sort of watch it and try to figure it out. But I also think the Bloc over the years has been a sort of party when people aren't sure they want the Liberals or Conservatives. They sort of park their vote there. Given the circumstances that everyone has talked about on the panel so far, I think people are like, no, we can't park our vote this time around. We really need to make a choice between the 2 parties that traditionally have governed.
Yeah, it feels very much like it circles back, Rob, to kind of what Tom wrote near the outset of this election, which obviously, as Tom will acknowledge, got some pushback from current sitting members of the NDP. But at the same time, ultimately, it feels like Canadians are very focused on who will form government in the choices that exist for that.
Yeah, and as Tom made that point in his piece early on in the campaign, it's a 2-horse race because only 2 men, both representing Ottawa area ridings, both originally from Alberta, can and both sons of teachers can be prime minister, and these are serious circumstances that we're in, Vashi, and I think that's the sense that that we're all seeing. That's what Nick Nanos is showing in his polls. I feel for the Conservative campaign. If you'd told them, 6 months ago, you'll be at almost 40% going into the debates, they would have think, well, we're going to romp to victory. The problem is the New Democrats, the Greens, and the PPC and the Bloc have just basically vanished. So it's an extraordinary outcome, or poised to be an extraordinary outcome when you could have a losing party. The leader could lose his own seat potentially, and could lose his job even if he does win his seat, and yet finish with a greater percentage of the popular vote than Stephen Harper did in two of his elections.
Yeah, lots for us to talk about insofar as how will this potentially inform the debates coming up starting tomorrow. We're going to talk about that with our front bench. The French debate gets moved to a new time because of the Montreal Canadiens, and the English debate takes place on Thursday. We'll unpack the stakes for all the party leaders just ahead.
Why do you have the worst attendance record in the House of Commons of any member of Parliament? If you want to be Prime Minister, you better learn how to be a member of Parliament first. Most Canadians, if they don't show up for work, they don't get a promotion.
You do not have a monopoly on patriotism. And I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian. I want to tell you that I come from a Canadian family and I love Canada. And that's why I did it, to promote prosperity.
With one signature of a pen, you've reversed that, thrown us into the north-south influence of the United States, and will reduce us, I'm sure, to a colony of the United States, because when the economic levers go, the political independence is sure to follow.
In just 24 hours from now, all 5 party leaders will be on the debate stage in Montreal facing off in French in the first debate of the campaign, which was, by the way, just moved from 8 o'clock Eastern to 6 o'clock Eastern to avoid any conflict with the Habs game as that team tries to clinch a playoff spot. And as you just saw in those clips, debates can at times be pivotal moments in an election. In a case of kind of deja vu, 1988, Brian Mulroney and John Turner had that intense exchange over free trade with the U.S. That issue will certainly be back in the spotlight in both the English and French language debates this week. Let's talk about all this with our front bench, Brian Gallant, James Moore, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. James, I got to start with you because there's a piece on our website in which the headline is, James Moore, leaders' debates have come to mean less and less. Why do you think that? And do you think this one will be any different?
Well, first of all this talk about playoff hockey as a Canucks fan is nothing short of an attack. But I'm glad I'm glad we're able to accommodate for some of you. No, but look, leaders' debates. Leaders' debates can matter. For sure, they can matter. You showed a couple clips that did have some consequence. But look, leaders' debates are the Hollywood moment of an election campaign. It's a clash. I think we overemphasize them relative to their importance. 19 times out of 20, they don't actually result in much. You see in leaders' debates what you saw throughout the campaign. It's just they happen to be standing in the same room together. And also, I think leaders' debates are, again, a good communications moment where you can perhaps sort of land a good shot on your opponent. But to be an effective prime minister of this country, all the skills that make you an effective debater have nothing to do with being an effective prime minister. To be a good debater, you have to be quick on your feet, quick with the comeback, quick with the punch, make a quick decision. Being an effective prime minister is about being deliberative. It's about consulting. It's about being thoughtful. It's about measuring twice and cutting once and doing your homework and being dispassionate and thoughtful. It's not about being quick and snappy. So it'll be good TV, possibly. Will it be of consequence? Possibly, but historically that has not been the case. But there could be a moment here, again, where I said in the last segment, where Pierre Poilievre could present himself to Canadians in a way that they haven't seen, where they can see in a relatively young man who's 45, Mark Carney is 60, somebody who has been in politics for a long time, but has emerged and has matured and has clearly built a movement. And maybe a lot of Canadians might say, why is it that almost 4 out of 10 Canadians think that this guy should be prime minister? And they'll give him a moment and they'll give him a look. And after giving him a look, they might say, as they did to Justin Trudeau in 2015, you know what? I think this guy's worth a chance, and I think we're worth having a guy like him as prime minister. So there's a door that's open that he could walk through, and we'll have to see.
I feel like insofar as I understand James' point about the moments and the overhype, the one thing that this does offer Canadians at a particularly timing-wise significant point in the campaign, Brian, just ahead of a long weekend where they're going to talk with their families, is like 2 hours to look at the two people who want to be prime minister. And we really haven't had any kind of, like, they haven't done many long form one-on-one interviews. Like, there just hasn't been that kind of opportunity throughout the campaign so far. The numbers were good for the last two debates. More people, I think, in the 2021 debate watched that debate in Canada than even watched the Super Bowl that year. So there is opportunity. I don't know if they make good on it, but there's opportunity there.
Well, first off, I absolutely don't know why, but I just love the fact that the debate got changed, the timing of it. I think that's just so quintessential Canadian. So it's just that's awesome. That's number one. Number two, I agree with James in theory, in the sense that debates themselves don't necessarily have a huge impact all of the time, and maybe often they don't. But as you mentioned, sometimes they do. And nowadays, it's probably less about the moment in the debate itself or the sort of performance in the debate, but it's really like the one moment, 10 seconds, that will get headlines and sort of potentially go viral the next day. Times have sort of changed. Now, other factors that I think have changed a little bit. This is an election, polling would show, that Canadians feel is actually important. Every election, everyone tries to say this is one of the most important elections for our jurisdiction, federally or provincially. But in this case, Canadians actually believe that. So that will lend itself to having more people participate. There are less to watch it. There are less debates. So that could also have maybe an impact in the sense that, well, there's only a couple, so I'm going to tune in. I also think that given what has happened to Carney and the Liberals and sort of his ascent, that, and look, obviously it's because of his economic sort of experience, and I think people see that maybe his credentials are right for the moment, but he's still unknown to some degree. So I do think there's a lot of people that still want to sort of see him, get to know him. So this would be an opportunity for that. There's the questions about his French, so that could obviously increase the eyeballs on the French debate. So I do think there's actually quite a bit kind of lining up that these debates will matter. And to your point, I do think that after this week, based on the fact that it's the debate week and we have a long weekend where a lot of family and friends are going to get together, or even just people get to have a pause and to think about the election, they'll probably start to make up their minds. And I think we're going to find ourselves with it being cemented at one point next week.
Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Brian makes a good point. I mean, Tom has had a front row seat to one of these debates. He was on the stage in 2015 when I think while watching that debate, I was watching for the sparring between Stephen Harper and Tom Mulcair. I thought Trudeau was kind of going to be a bit of a sideshow to that one. And in the foreign policy debate in particular, in that one, I thought Trudeau surprised me and did better than I thought he would. And I think a lot of voters, and I don't vote in elections, as you know, Vashi, but I think a lot of voters watched that contest and said, well, that they're going to give Trudeau a try. So I think James makes a very good point. If Poilievre can make an impression to people who aren't sure about him and think maybe he's not ready, then he could close that gap with Mr. Carney. Having said that, it will be very, very hard for Mr. Poilievre to close the gap and then build a lead big enough that he can win a majority government for the Tories. It's going to be very, very tough for him. I just don't see a path to a majority for the Conservatives the way things are set right now. I do see a way they could perhaps win the most seats and win the popular vote, but I don't know about a majority with the NDP and the Bloc being so low.
When Rob references those 2015 debates, Tom, I remember watching them as well. And when he talks about the Trudeau sort of surpassing rather of expectations, it was about expectations. The friend of our show, Corey Tonight, who said if he shows up with pants on, right, like it's going to be a stellar performance.
I remember that remark.
And when he not only wore pants, but also was able to, not fall off the stage, people thought, oh, wait a second, like this is something I can entertain. How important are setting expectations going into this week?
Very important. And you're right to reference the 2015 campaign, because I have a slightly different take from James on that, because Mr. Trudeau had low expectations and they'd been pushed down even further by Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper had asked for and obtained the longest campaign in Canadian history because his working hypothesis was show Trudeau long enough and people will get to say nice hair, but nothing else. And Trudeau, as you say, well, he's not that bad. I mean, that's a mistake of trying to really push down the other candidate. Mr. Poilievre just going back 8-10 weeks ago, was riding high in the polls. The landscape changed completely. Mr. Trudeau announced his departure. Mr. Trump was sworn in. Mr. Carney became Liberal leader. And he's had a dickens of a time trying to adjust to that massive change. I'll say perhaps a word, because I do live and work in Quebec mostly. And let me just say a word about the shape of things here. Mr. Poilievre always had trouble breaking through. His numbers were nowhere near what they were in the rest of Canada here in Quebec at any of those moments. And ask anybody who works in our field what's happening with their friends who are, because that's a good chunk of the population, so you wind up having a lot of friends who happen to be sovereignists. They're all saying this is not an election to talk about that. This is an election to have a strong voice. And this is James's point, have one person who can talk for Canada. And in Quebec, that's coalescing around Carney. I mean, there's no two ways about it. They were sending out people early on to try to spin. I remember one guy from, one of Mr. Harper, from Harper's era, going on to Montreal a few weeks ago saying, guy can barely speak French. And you know why? Because he doesn't like Quebec. So they were trying to spin that. Now, Carney's done several turns on French television. His French is fine, thank you. And I had him to the university to talk to a graduate class on environment. Complicated subject. He knew it cold, and he did it in French, and everybody understood every word. So I would say that Quebec and the GTA, and I don't want to hurt, Jim's already been hurt by not talking about the Canucks, but Vancouver is important, but I think that the two real fields where this is going to be determined are the Greater Toronto Area and Quebec. And the sense that I'm getting on the ground is that the swing that we're seeing here in Quebec is going to resemble the orange wave of 2011 that Jack and I pulled off. But this time it's the guy with the orange face who's going to be moving a lot of those votes.
Okay, I gotta leave it on that note. Thanks everyone so much. Our front bench. I apologize. I gotta go to our commercial. Thanks everyone. Back in a moment. Welcome back to Power Play. Tomorrow night, the two debates get underway. The first of the two, I should say. The French debate will now start at 6 o'clock Eastern from Montreal instead of 8 o'clock to make way for the Habs game, which, of course, could clinch their playoff entrance. The English debate takes place at 7 o'clock Eastern on Thursday. We are going to be live from Montreal on both nights. We'll have special coverage tomorrow of that French debate and then extended special coverage on Thursday for the English debate from 5 to 7. We'll do a pre-game or pre-debate analysis show. And then afterward for 2 hours as well, you'll hear one-on-one from the leaders as they take questions from reporters and analysis from our Sunday Strats, Corey Tonight, Scott Reed, and Kathleen Monk. I'll leave Power Play there. I'm Vashi Kapelos. Have a wonderful rest of your night.